So today you might not guess the topic based on my state of dress, which is perhaps more Cinderella and less spooky, but I wanted to do another Halloween scented video, and in this one I wanted to tell you some scary stories. So all of the stories that I got for this video are from a website called Jezebel, which has the best scary stories. They're so good. They do a yearly spooky story competition, and if you go back and you read through all the entries, oh, they're so good. But today I will be telling you 7 of the stories I found on there that I liked the most, and it was really hard to narrow down, so I tried to pick ones that were spooky, less on the true sort of violence side and more on the just generally quite creepy side. So you'll have to let me know which one is your favourite. Also, a lot of these didn't have titles, so I gave them titles because I thought that would be better. So our first story it was untitled. I've called it Silly Duck, and this is by the user Parasite Eve. This happened to me a few years ago, and I still get chills every time I think about it. I agreed to watch my nieces and nephew for my brother and his wife at their house since they had to be out of town for the day. My nephew and one niece had school that morning, but my other niece was only 4, so she stayed home with me. We spent the morning watching cartoons and colouring until it was finally time for her nap. She was lying down on the sofa, so I tucked her in with a blanket, making sure she was completely cocooned in the blanket, all nice and cosy. I turned the volume on the TV down till I could barely hear it, taking care not to wake her up, and went into the kitchen to work on my maths homework. I'm really short, only 4'10", and my feet often don't touch the ground when I'm sitting down, so I tend to sort of swing my feet absent-mindedly when I'm sitting. As I sat at the kitchen table looking at the laptop and swinging my feet, I kicked something. I assumed it must have been the leg of another chair, so I moved my foot back. As I go to move that leg again, I feel something touch higher up on my leg, almost up to my knee. I jerk myself back in the chair and look under the table, and there's nothing there that would have been close to my knee. I brush it off and get back to my homework. About 15 minutes later, I hear the pitter-patter of small feet in the next room. Assuming my niece has woken up and was trying to be sneaky, I walked into the living room and was surprised to see my niece still lying on the couch, perfectly cocooned in the blanket. She was awake now and asked me, "Did you hear that too?" At this point, I was a little freaked out, but I explained to her that the noise was probably the wind outside knocking twigs off the tree onto the roof. She didn't seem worried about it at all, and since it was the middle of the afternoon, I stopped feeling creeped out. We went into the kitchen so I could get lunch ready, and she crawled under the table to get her doll that had somehow managed to end up under there. While she was down there, she started making a raspy noise, almost like a quack, but not like how kids will say quack when they're imitating ducks. She did this a few times and still hadn't come out from under the table. So I asked her, "Are you being a silly little duck?" She stopped for a second and stuck out her head from under the table and asked what I said. I repeated, "Are you a cute little silly duck quacking under there?" She calmly looked at me and said, "I'm not quacking." "Well then, what noise are you making if it's not a quack?" She shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'm making the same noise as the boy." "What boy?" I asked. "The boy under the table. He keeps making that noise and going like this." To which she starts touching her throat. A huge chill went up my spine as she made that noise when my brain made the connection. She was mimicking choking. She was imitating a little boy who appeared to be choking under the table, the same table under which I had felt something touch my leg not even an hour earlier. I pulled her out from under the table and told her we were going to the park until it was time to pick up her siblings, and we stayed out all day until their parents got back, and I have never stepped foot back in that house. I was very relieved when they moved a couple of years ago. Story number 2 I have named EME by the user The City Girl. The one I'm sharing tonight is not mine, it's my mum's, but she's one of the most honest and skeptical people I know. It's also been corroborated by other people who were there, and I've seen a clipped article that also shows a certain thing happened. Names have been changed to protect privacy for reasons that will become obvious. When my mum was a young high school student, Ouija boards had become so popular that they'd even made their way into her small Midwest town, and they'd become mainstream enough that even her Lutheran parents let her get one for sleepovers. The first night they ever played, their questions started off innocently enough. They asked things like, "Does anyone have a crush on me?" or "What will I be when I grow up?" The Ouija board was unresponsive at first, but then it became more active, which was followed by good-natured accusations of who was pushing it, but they continued to play. The questions got progressively darker until at one point someone asked, "Will someone we know soon die?" Okay, I'm a total skeptic like my mum, but even I would never ask that. My mum said that until then she hadn't taken any of it seriously, but that a chill went through her and she felt distinctly unnerved. The feeling intensified when the planchette slid onto the E, then slowly crept over to the M, at which point everyone shot looks towards my mum. When it made its way back to E, she said she got a profound feeling of dread and she jerked her hands away. Considering my mum's name is Emily, everyone understood why she'd react that way and they stopped playing. Obviously nothing happened to my mum, but less than a month later, my mum's best friend's boyfriend, Emerson, was tragically killed in a car accident. Her best friend had been there that night. She's the one who had asked the question. When I was a little older and heard this story again, I said, maybe it really was meant to have spelled out Emily. If you hadn't been taking it very seriously, maybe one of your friends decided to mess with you so that you'd be creeped out and get more into it. But of course, we'll never know. And yet, when visiting my maternal grandparents last summer, my friend and I found that exact Ouija board stored up in the attic. One day, when there was a raging thunderstorm, we brought it all the way down to the finished basement to play for the first time. This was middle school and we didn't have cell phones yet, nor was there a clock in this particular room, and we weren't wearing watches. It was young teens and it was summer vacation. So when we became immersed in the game, we lost all track of time. Just like my mum had experienced, at first nothing happened, but it then became active and flew all over the place, with answers to our questions about the spirit's identity and origin. Like my mum, I'm skeptical of these things, so I was convinced my friend was moving it, and at certain points I said so, but naturally she denied it. As a test, I held eye contact with her, so that she couldn't try to look around for the answer, and I asked, "What time is it right here at this very moment?" The board immediately spelled out 2:31. We jumped to our feet and raced up 2 flights of stairs where I knew the nearest clock was located. It was 2:31. I'm sure it was either one amazing guess or my friend has a freakishly good sense of time. The experience made my mum's story about the exact same board just a little bit more creepy. Okay, I know all the skeptics are gonna be like, shut up, but please don't play with Ouija boards. I've heard so many bad stories. Just don't risk it. Don't do it. Don't do it. The next story was untitled again. I named it The Rainbow, and it is by the user Mr. Hughes is Badass. My parents thought they were just going to have one child. Me. My mum had my brother the summer before I started 4th grade. I was relatively okay with this. My mum had a C-section and her mum came to stay because my baby brother was freaking huge and my dad had to get back to work. People were very generous and lots of gifts were sent to the hospital. One gift included a helium balloon with a rainbow on it. The first sign of trouble was when I woke up and the balloon was in my room with me. This was odd since I slept with my door closed, but I figured it must have gotten in before I shut my door, or my grandmother had opened my door to check on me or something. The next day, the balloon was floating over my brother's crib. The 3rd day, I was in the shower washing my hair, with the bathroom door closed and the shower curtain also closed, when I turned from the faucet and the balloon was in the shower with me. My screams woke the baby. My mum was furious with me. She locked the balloon in a closet. That night, she woke up and the balloon was over her. When she woke up in the morning, the balloon was still in the closet. That morning, my grandmother went outside with me so I could swim. We had a small deck off of an enclosed porch and then stairs leading down to the pool. I was standing on the diving board facing the porch when I heard the porch door, screen door, so it opened out instead of in, open. I thought my mum was coming out. It was the balloon. It turned on the deck so the rainbow was facing me. Then it started walking down the stairs like a human. The balloon didn't just float from the deck into the yard like a balloon, it went down each step like a person or an animal climbed stairs. I was screaming from the point the balloon came out instead of my mum, and my grandmother joined the chorus. The screen door opened again. This time, my mum ran out with scissors. She had been standing in the kitchen looking at my grandmother and I through the window and saw the screen door open and the balloon came out. She chased the balloon down and as she stabbed it, over and over and over, the balloon screamed. A little backstory. My mum's brother completed suicide a couple of years prior to this. Oddly, my brother and I favour him to an insane degree. Not only do we physically resemble him far more than we do our actual parents, but apparently we have his mannerisms, gestures and patterns of speech, although I spent very little time with him as a small child, and my brother was born after his death. More backstory. He killed himself in a work truck. My family decided to have the work truck crushed. The work truck did not agree. First it refused to crank. Then it almost killed someone as it was loaded onto the flatbed tow truck. Then as they unloaded it into the crusher, it cranked and almost ran over someone else. My other uncle also reported seeing a weird creature standing on his staircase, staring at him silently for a couple of years after his brother died. That's mostly the end, except that my brother has had a lifelong fear of balloons. Oh, and that my own daughter was born on the anniversary of my uncle's death. And one day, when she was a preschooler and we got a cat, she turned to me, smiled, and said, "I'm going to name it Rainbow. You need to know that the rainbow was never going to hurt you." Our fourth story is untitled, but I named it Seats for One, and it's by the user iChill. When I was about 14, I went down to San Antonio with my family and a buddy of mine. We were staying at a hotel that was right next to Six Flags Fiesta, Texas. Since we were staying at the hotel, they gave us free tickets and early access to the park, which was awesome. So me and my buddy go in, and we are basically the only people there with maybe a few other hotel guests. Now my buddy was terrified of roller coasters, so I basically rode all the rides by myself that day. After about an hour, I decided I want to ride the Rattler, which is an old wooden roller coaster, basically the same as the Texas Giant. I get up to the coaster, but there is no line, so I go straight to the front cart. I thought I was going to be the only one riding, but another young teenager walks up and asks if he can sit with me at the last second. I say sure, no big deal. We both strap in, but the cart attendant only checked my seat to see if it was secure. However, I just thought that if you checked one side, both sides were safe. So the ride starts, all good, the coaster was fun. When the ride stops, me and the teenager get off the ride and I tell him, "Take it easy," and he does the same. I walk out of the ride in front of the other passenger toward the little area where it shows you the picture it took when going down the big fall. I walk up to the screen and wait for my picture. Since it was early, no one was working the counter to buy the pictures, but they still showed up at the TVs. Like I said before, it was just me on the ride before the teenager got on at the last second. When the picture showed up, I just about peed my pants. It was just me in the picture. No one was sitting next to me. It was an empty chair. There wasn't a glare, there wasn't anything that would have obscured the teen sitting next to me. I ran back up to the top of the ride to ask the cart attendant, but I guess they had switched shifts or something because it was not the same person. I looked all over for the kid around the ride and throughout the park the rest of the day, and I never saw him again. It was one of the craziest things that's ever happened, and I will forever believe in ghosts because of it. I wish I could have bought the picture at the time. Even in the years afterwards, I have researched to see if there were any accidents on that ride or if there's any weird deaths before the park was built. I found no information on the kid I rode with or any of the accidents there. The next story was untitled again. I called it Turning Pages, and it's by the user Bubbles Blue. My husband and I purchased our first house together. It needed a lot of renovation work, but we got it for a pretty reasonable price because of this. It was a small house, but I was totally in love with it. And the backyard. It was a huge, long, kind of narrow backyard and definitely overgrown. We shared one fence with a neighbour and an empty, overgrown lot to the other side. At the back of the yard was a little strip of wooded area that split two neighbourhoods. There was a steep ravine with a stream at the base. You couldn't really walk from the wooded area to our yard without having a hard time. My husband and I intended to build a garden and chicken coop once we got settled with our house remodel. We had been living there for almost 6 months at the time of this story. I spent most of my time in the kitchen, not cooking or anything, my husband does that, but it was the warmest part of the house and I was always freezing. It had a little nook near the window that I would sit at and I would partake in my guilty pleasure of reading these horrible romance books. They were bad but also so good. My husband would often make fun of me. I would always leave them there on the counter when I finished with the last page I read bookmarked. Nothing strange ever really happened, except when I returned to my book the marker would be on a completely different page. I would yell at my husband for messing up my place even though he denied it. Little things would move to different places, nothing too odd, and I chalked it up to me setting stuff down and forgetting. The living room was definitely the coldest place in the house. It was situated at the front of the house in a weird little hallway with two closets facing each other separating it from the kitchen. We planned to knock them down and make the kitchen and living room open up to each other. We were storing most of our stuff upstairs in the bedrooms while we were doing construction on the front of the house, so we had to enter through the yard to the back door. One Saturday morning, I was exhausted and told my husband that I'd wait for him at home while he went to the hardware store. He had just left when I made myself some coffee. I puttered around the kitchen for some snacks and was planning to finish a book while waiting for his return. I remember the kitchen suddenly getting cold, so much so that I could see the steam coming from my coffee. I decided to go upstairs and grab a blanket. I was annoyed at how long it was taking for me to find one. I'm walking down the stairs, freezing, already wrapped in my blanket, turned to the living room to head back into the kitchen, and stopped dead in my tracks. There is a man standing in the weird hallway, and he's holding a knife. My heart jumped into my throat, and I was choking on it. I can't scream, and I can't move. We're just standing there for what seems like forever, even though it's probably seconds because I do not remember what he looked like. I'm fixated on the knife. He starts to move toward me, and in a second, out of nowhere, a blood-curdling scream comes from directly behind me, followed by what I can only describe as a loud bang. Both the intruder and I fall to the ground, and he bolts from the ground to the back door. I try to crawl to escape, but I collapse like one of those fainting goats and I can't move. A few moments later, my husband runs in sweating and pale as a ghost, and I think I squeak something to him. He swoops me up into a sitting position and pulls out his cell to call the police. Meanwhile, my body is shaking uncontrollably and I'm so confused about what is happening. I crawl to the kitchen, past the knife he dropped so I could keep an eye on my husband, and I start to feel warmth as soon as I enter. I slowly stop shaking and feel calm. My husband comes back and he tells me he had this incredible sense of dread and something was telling him to turn around and come back. Long story short, the police don't find the guy, but they did say that he had probably been watching us and he knew when my husband left. To this day, I think back on that scream, which I'm 90% sure was not mine. I think there's a woman I share my kitchen with who is a nice entity who makes it feel warm and cozy and also has my same garbage taste in books. I think that morning, when the kitchen got cold, she left to get help, or maybe she was trying to get me away from the yard. Either way, I leave books out for her as a thank you. The sixth story was untitled, but I've named it I'll Take Care of Them, and it is by the user Tony. When I was 14, I worked in a doll shop on the first floor of an old colonial house. At the time, I loved dolls and it was my absolute dream job. Since I was so young, one of the elderly owners usually worked the register while I ran around the floor and storage room. At the front of the store was a large display of life-sized baby dolls. They looked extremely realistic and even felt real when you held them. There were maybe 15 to 20 of these dolls, propped up on tables or displayed in bassinets like an uncanny nursery. Shortly after I started working, I noticed that the baby dolls sometimes moved around the shop. They turned up in strange places or in unnatural positions, like face down on a table. I was the only person working the floor, and I watched our customers very closely due to shoplifters, but I still assumed it must be from customers messing with them. Then one day I went in the storage room, and when I turned to leave, the door was locked. The room was really just a narrow closet lined with shelves stacked floor to ceiling with dolls in their coffin-like boxes. I started banging on the door, and eventually the owner heard me freaking out and opened it. Very nonchalantly, the owner proceeded to explain that the store used to be a brothel where a woman and her baby died in childbirth. He then advised that if I ever got locked in the storage room when I was alone in the shop, I should promise out loud to take good care of the ghost's babies, and she would usually open the door. Usually? Usually! The final story freaks me out kind of the most. It is called The Red House by One Upon a Little Lane 21855. This is a story my mother told us as kids. I believe it to be true as she has never faltered. My mother grew up poor. My grandpa worked at the sewage plant, and my grandma was a lunch lady for the local school and did laundry and cleaning in the summers. They were extremely frugal and were saving for a house of their own. In the meantime, they rented apartments in bad neighborhoods to save on rent. One day, they saw an advertisement for an upper apartment, an older home split into a duplex. It was in a slightly nicer, safer area and was surprisingly affordable. My mum was about 2 years old, and my grandma was pregnant with her second child, and safer was what they needed. They decided to move in. My mum drove past it a few years ago, now painted a bright, sunny yellow. At the time they moved in, it was a rusty red. Barn red, as the paint was cheap. The lower unit was vacant, which suited them just fine. After years of being packed like sardines in tiny apartments stacked on top of each other, it was nice and almost luxurious. The trouble started a few weeks in. Windows would shut by themselves. Old houses can be unpredictable, they thought, but sometimes the windows would also open by themselves, which was harder to explain. It was summer, so they left the windows open most of the time. Their next-door neighbour started to complain about noises. "Why are you flushing the toilets and slamming things all day?" they asked. My grandparents were stumped, as they usually both worked, and my mum was at Nana's house during the day. They assumed the lower unit was being rented and worked on, but looking into the windows revealed no workers, no people, just dust. Then my mum started to have nightmares. Not the usual type, but night terrors, screaming and inconsolable. My grandma would rock her to sleep, and would sometimes fall asleep with my mum, her head against the wall, and my mum in her crib. One night she heard footsteps over and over. My mum woke up, stared at my grandma, and whispered, "It's here, it's here." The sounds were coming from the back of the closet. My grandma yelled for her husband. Grandpa peeled back the wood panel behind the closet. There were a set of stairs from when the house was a single-family home. The owners had boarded them over. At my grandma's request, Grandpa grabbed a flashlight and looked around. There were no footprints in the thick dust, and no disturbances to the net of cobwebs. He nailed the panel back and sensibly suggested they all needed a little bit more sleep. My mum slept in their room for a few nights, but ultimately was put back to sleep in her own room. The night she was put back is seared into her memory, to the point she has repeated it many times and never deviates. She again heard the footsteps slowly coming up the stairs. She started to cry silently and lay in her crib, pretending to be asleep as the footsteps drew closer. She felt someone standing over her. Hoping it was one of her parents, she cracked one eye open. It was not Grandma or Grandpa. My mum describes him as an old man. Not old like Nana, but old like a mummy. Sallow skin, sunken cheeks, and long grey stringy hair. He smiled at her. He had broken brown teeth, sharp and jagged. He was shirtless, and she could see his skin was ragged and thick like a callus. He had impossibly long fingers, topped with thick, sharp yellow fingernails. He reached into the crib. At this point, my mum screamed, and screamed, and screamed. Grandma and Grandpa finally stumbled into the room. The next day, they started finding a different place to live immediately. While they searched, my mum slept every night in between her parents. I once asked why they took my mum so seriously. She said, "They found me on the other side of the room, next to the closet." So those are my 7 spooky stories for the Halloween season. I hope this video was interesting. I know I don't typically do narration or anything. That is actually something I would really like to get into, so let me know what you thought of my narrating skills. But I love a good spooky story, and I really love if you let me know which of the 7 was your favourite, and also let me know of your favourite spooky stories. Maybe they're from experience, maybe they're from family members or friends, or maybe they're ones you've heard online. Drop them in the comments and we will have a good old spooky lark together. Happy spooky season, and please remember to have courage and be kind, and may all of your dreams come true, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye! Spooky, spooky, spooky. Honestly, if any of these happened to me, I'd just never sleep again. Who needs to sleep? Sleep is overrated. Spooky, spooky, spooky. We had been living there for almost 6 months.